A few years ago when I was first ordained, I used to have trouble coming up with a homily. And some people might say I still do. But I used to make a call, and I'd tell everybody, I said, make a call to this Cajun theologian. And he gave me a story to start off with. And Boudreaux said that he was one day looking for a job, and he was been laid off for a couple of months, and he finally got an interview. So he's in this parking lot of this humongous building, and the parking lot looked like it went on for miles and miles. So everyone was parked as close to the building as possible. And it was one of these typical Louisiana summer days, right? About 96, 97 degrees. Seemed like 130% humidity. So he figured if he parked far away and walked in, he'd be soaked with sweat by the time he got to the door. That wouldn't be good for the interview. So he's driving around and he's trying to find a close spot, and he starts praying, and he says, God, look, he says, I really need this. I need this job. Please, you got to help me. He says, I'd like to park close so I don't get all sweaty. And he says, I tell you what. He said, if you can find me a spot close enough, he said, I'll start going to church at least twice a month. Then he drives around a little bit longer, and he says, no, God, he says, you know what? He says, I know I'm being selfish, and he says, I really need to find a close spot to park. He says, if you help me find a spot close enough, he said, I'll try to go to Mass at least once a week. And he drives a little bit more, and he says, God, he says, I know, he says, I realize, he says, I tell you what I'll do. He says, I will, if you can find me a spot and help me get this job, he said, I'll start to pray every day, and I will make it my point to go to Mass every Sunday. And then he turns the corner, and all of a sudden he notices, that first spot, that first regular parking spot next to the handicap spots by the door, he saw the backup lights come on a car. And when he turned that corner and he saw those backup lights, he said, oh, never mind, God. He says, I think I found one. How often could we relate to that, right? We're praying for something, and we're after, we have some kind of goal, or we need something from God. And all of a sudden we accomplish it, and we take credit for it. Can we relate to that? Right? We all can. I think everybody has done that from time to time. But today, as Catholic Christians, we need to know that we have to give our gratitude to God. We have to give God the thanks and the glory. A few years ago, Pope Francis did an interview with a reporter, and the reporter asked him, and he called him by his given name, not by Pope Francis, and I don't know how to pronounce that. So he asked him, he says, who is Pope Francis? And the Pope kind of paused a little bit, and he says, do you need me to ask you the question again? He goes, no. He says, I was thinking. He says, he is a sinner. Now, if Pope Francis would classify himself as a sinner, right, none of us can say that we're not, right? If the Pope says, I am a sinner, then we have to say that we are sinners also. And besides, if you stand up and you say, well, I am not a sinner, that's a sin because that's our pride taking over, right? So, but the Pope says that he classifies himself as a sinner. And I always said that, when we come to Mass, Mass should be a Sinners Anonymous meeting because we all come here to be healed by Jesus. And that's what the Pope was talking about. He said, I am a sinner because I am in need of Jesus Christ in my life. You see, in the second reading, it tells us, he says, if we deny him, he will deny us. And that's true. If we tell Jesus that we don't need him, he won't be in our life. He'll leave us to what we want to do. He'll leave us to ourselves. But it says that if we are unfaithful, that he can't be unfaithful to us because he can't deny himself. And how glorious is that, right? How great is that we know that the God of the universe is always going to be faithful to us, even though we sin, even though we fail. It's just like going to confession. And I hope most of us go to confession. All of us should be going to confession. But when we go to confession and we confess our sins, do we walk out of that confessional in the thanks to God for forgiving our sins, or do we focus on those sins, right? Because that's not what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to be thanking God for the blessings that He pours upon us each and every day. God blesses us all the time. Do we see those blessings? Do we recognize God moving in our life? And if we don't, it's because we're not looking, because we're putting ourselves ahead of everything else. That we put ourselves ahead of God. You see, I can accomplish nothing without Him. So I have to give everything to Him. Because that's who provides it to me. Because He will never be unfaithful to me, even though I'm unfaithful to Him. You see, like the 10 lepers, right? The 10 lepers come up to Jesus and they hollered, Jesus, have mercy on us. And as they're walking off, they realize they're healed, and only one comes back. How many times have we fallen and asked Jesus or God for that healing, and we get healed, but yet we forget to thank Him? See, my point is that we need to focus on the blessings, not so much on our faults as much as on the blessings, right? Because I am a broken person. I fail so often. But to know that God continues to bless me, you see, to change my life by focusing on the positive rather than continuously looking at the negative. You see, they tell us that we got to figure out our faults in life so that we can correct them and move on. Well, maybe if I start focusing on the positives in my life, I can focus on those positives and move forward from the positives. And the negatives will take care of themselves. Isn't that an awesome thought? That my life can be better by focusing on what God is doing in my life, not always focusing on myself. At the end of that interview, Pope Francis said that he calls himself a sinner because he looks to the grace of God. And he said by looking at the grace of God and the mercy of God, he can become a better son. And by becoming a better son, he can be a better father. The challenge to us is to focus on those blessings from God, to focus on God's grace in our life, God's mercy in our life, so that we can be better sons and daughters, so that we can be better brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, so that the world can be a better place. Wouldn't it be awesome if people looked at us and saw the positives in our life, because we start to live for the positives. We start to live for the grace of God. And it shows. And people look at us and say, that's what I want. I want to be like them. God is calling us to focus on the positive. God is calling us to focus on His blessings and to thank Him for everything He does for us. Because you see, when we can see that, then we're able to know that it's not us. It's all about Him. He's calling us to be His disciples of love, of faith, of gratitude. He's challenging us to focus on the positives in our lives. Are we ready to take on that challenge? Are we ready to be the disciples that He's calling us to be?